We stand at the edge of something most people never question. A list carved into clay, copied and recopied for centuries, sitting quietly in museum glass, while the world scrolls past headlines and short clips. But tonight, you and I are not doing that. Tonight, we're going to stand still in front of one of the strangest documents our species has ever produced and ask what almost nobody dares to ask out loud. If this list is telling the truth, even partially, then the first rulers of humanity were not just kings, they were something else. Maybe the first kings on earth. Maybe not entirely human at all. Before we dive into the depths of this mystery together, I want to invite you into this journey properly. If you enjoy stepping beyond the surface, if you want more stories that treat you like a thinking mind and not just a view on a chart, make sure you subscribe. It helps us keep building this archive of forgotten knowledge together. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read them. I remember the names, the countries, the late night shifts, the long drives, the people who come back video after video. You're part of this investigation now, not just an audience. Imagine a room lit only by oil lamps, clay tablets stacked like small bricks on shelves, a scribe with steady hands pressing wedge-shaped signs into wet clay, line after line, not for entertainment, not for myth, but for order, for legitimacy, for a story that would link the rulers of his world to something older, higher, unquestionable. What he's writing down is not framed as fantasy. It's framed as a record, a sequence, a transmission from a time when kingship itself was said to descend from the sky, not invented by men, but granted. The first thing that hits anyone who actually reads these lines isn't the names, it's the numbers. You see reigns so long they shatter any sense of realism. Tens of thousands of years under a single ruler, lifespans that turn entire eras into the shadow of one name. This is where most people check out. They either laugh and call it myth, or they flinch and stop thinking about it. But you and I are not skipping this part, because the exaggeration, if that's what it is a clue in itself. And if it's not exaggeration, then the question becomes much more dangerous. Follow the pattern carefully. First, there is a world before a cataclysm, where a handful of rulers dominate time itself. Then there's a flood, a reset, a universal wound that appears not only here, but in other traditions across Mesopotamia, across the Levant, across cultures that should not, statistically, be telling the same kind of story. After this event, something breaks. The reigns collapse from impossible lengths into spans that fit within a human lifetime. That shift is not just cosmetic. It is the crack line where myth and memory start bleeding into one another. If we listen to the text the way ancient audiences did, it isn't saying, "Here is our fairy tale." It is saying, "Here's how power was passed down from an age of beings unlike us to people you might actually recognize." The earliest rulers are presented not as administrators, but as embodiments of something cosmic. Their right to rule did not arise from negotiation or councils or inheritance alone. It descended, it arrived with them. Their cities become more than cities. They become theaters where the border between human and otherworldly is temporarily suspended. Now picture yourself standing in the dust of the southern alluvium, among ruined mounds that used to be temples and palaces. The ground is layered with broken pottery and burnt brick. Somewhere beneath your feet, the first iterations of this list slept for millennia. Who wrote those early lines? Were they compiling older oral traces into an official sequence, or manufacturing an origin story for their current regime? Every stroke of the stylus has a motive. No ancient elite invests in a text like this without expectation of return. Power hides in the order of names. If these rulers that appear before the flood were entirely fictional, it would be easy to give them powers beyond measure and leave it at that. But the structure here is different. It doesn't wander. It doesn't spin wild adventures. It gives a name, a city, a duration, dry, almost bureaucratic. That dryness is unsettling. It reads less like a legend and more like an archive of something that no longer fits our categories. Either the scribes are encoding myth in the style of bookkeeping, or they are preserving a distorted echo of a system that predates what we call history. Think for a moment about what it means to claim that kingship came down from the heavens. In a world where every harvest, every flood, every eclipse is interpreted through divine intention, those words are political technology. If you can convince your people, your rivals, your neighbors, that your throne line extends back to an era when non-human or godlike beings established the rules, then challenging you stops being rebellion and starts being blasphemy. This is legitimacy written into time itself, a crown welded to the fabric of the cosmos. But under that political layer, there's another question I want us to sit with. What kind of memory survives as numbers no one can believe, but everyone keeps copying? Sometimes real events decay into impossible figures. A dynasty that lasted centuries becomes one name. Oral tradition stretches and fuses generations into a single towering ancestor. Dates expand as respect grows. Over time, a long-lived line becomes a superhuman king. If that's what happened here, then these first rulers may hide real power structures behind unrealistic lifespans, like a veil no one was meant to pierce. And yet, there is a tension the text never resolves for us. After the cataclysm, the pattern normalizes. We start to recognize rulers historians can cross-check, cities we can excavate, inscriptions we can match. The line between the incredible and the verifiable runs straight through this document like a scar. That is precisely where most mainstream readings quietly step back. But this channel exists because you don't step back. You lean closer. You want to know why the scribes chose not to simply erase the impossible past when they had every reason to streamline it. Let's stay with those early names a bit longer. When a ruler is said to reign for many thousands of years, that's not randomly chosen. In ancient numerology, specific totals signal completeness, cosmic cycles, ritual perfection. These spans may encode something like, this was an age when rulers embodied the totality of divine order. In other words, the message is less, this guy literally lived that long, and more, this office belonged to a category beyond human. It is a careful distinction, and it's easy to miss if we rush past the language. Now, if we flip the perspective for a moment and take the text at uncomfortable face value, we enter territory that modern historians avoid, but your curiosity doesn't. If, hypothetically, early elites were describing encounters with beings they perceived as higher, older, technologically, or intellectually beyond them, the only vocabulary they had was divine. The only framework they could use was rule. So those who guided, instructed, or dominated them became kings with unthinkable spans. To later scribes, preserving that memory meant wrapping it in religious and political language. In the quiet repetition of those reign lengths, there's also another layer: fear of discontinuity. Ancient societies were obsessed with proving that their current order was not accidental. They needed an unbroken chain from the first city to their present gate. This list does that. It refuses chaos. Even when the world is smashed by a flood, sovereignty does not vanish, it relocates. Kingship comes down again. The narrative insists there was always an order, always a line, always someone chosen. No gaps, no leaderless wilderness. That insistence alone tells you what people were afraid of. As we move along those lines, city after city, succession after succession, the text quietly performs something psychologically brilliant. It teaches its audience that human authority is an inheritance from an age when beings close to the divine shaped the world. That belief doesn't just place kings above scrutiny, it places the entire social hierarchy under a sacred umbrella. If your ruler stands in a shadow cast by primordial monarchs, then your obedience is participation in a cosmic story, not just survival under taxation and labor. For us, reading this now, the temptation is to slice the document in two. Myth at the front, history near the end. But doing that is our modern reflex, not theirs. They copied the whole thing. They treated it as one continuum. And that is exactly why it matters. This single, clay-carved sequence allows us to watch in slow motion how an early civilization stitched together divine memory, political agenda, and fragments of real chronology into a single spine of authority. In that spine, the first kings on earth are not just characters, they're anchors. What I want you to notice as we walk through this together is how personal this becomes once you stop treating it like an abstract artifact. Someone decided where to start the human story. Someone decided which names survive, whose reigns are rounded, whose are cut. Every omission is a verdict. Every survival is a victory. And somewhere in those editorial choices, you can feel the ghost of the first scribes reaching forward to us, insisting that we remember a world that began under rulers who stood halfway between those below them and those above. If those early reigns are symbolic, we have to decode the symbolism. If they are distorted memories, we have to ask, memories of what? If they are theological propaganda, we must understand why the propagandists preferred impossible numbers instead of modest, believable ones. None of those answers are simple, and none of them reduce this to a trivial curiosity. That's why you're here. You're not here for a headline. You're here to pick at the stitches until we see what's underneath. Stay with this question. Why didn't they just start the list with the first verifiable kings? Why burden their own legitimacy with outrageous reign spans that critics, even in the ancient world, could have mocked? Perhaps because erasing those names meant erasing an origin their culture could not afford to lose. To deny the first kings was to deny that kingship itself was a sacred trust. It is safer to leave them towering and untouchable, even if no one fully understands them anymore. By the time later readers encountered this text, those earliest figures had already become silhouettes on a distant ridge of time. People accepted them the way modern nations accept legendary founders, not because they make sense, but because they give shape to identity. Yet the pattern here is older, sharper, stranger. When we place this record alongside other early traditions, parallels begin to form that are too precise to ignore and too explosive to rush through. And that's where we're going next, you and I. We're going to start lining those echoes up and see what they imply. As we move forward, I want you to remember something simple. You're not just consuming a story. You're part of how these questions survive. Every time you choose a long, demanding video like this over instant distraction, you're voting for depth. You're choosing to keep uncomfortable mysteries alive. And that's why I speak to you directly. Because without people like you, this kind of work doesn't exist. These tablets stay silent. The names fade a little more each year. So we've set the stage. We've stepped into the dim light of that scribal room, traced the impossible lifespans, and watched the flood slice reality in two. We've seen how a single sequence of rulers can serve as theology, propaganda, memory, and maybe, just maybe, a distorted window into an age before our own. Now it's time to start pulling specific names and patterns apart and to place them against the wider ancient world to see what holds. Imagine you're holding one of those tablets in your hands right now. Its surface isn't smooth, it's rough, cracked, scarred by time. The wedge-shaped marks dig deep, each one pressed by a hand that lived 5,000 years ago. You tilt it under the light, and for a moment, the symbols seem alive. Those are not just names and numbers. They are echoes of a worldview that once held the entire universe together. The Sumerians didn't see history as we do. For them, the boundary between myth and fact didn't exist. The world of gods and men overlapped, and the clay preserved both as truth. If you were a Sumerian scribe in the city of Nippur, you'd begin by invoking the gods before even touching the clay. The act of writing wasn't mechanical, it was sacred. Each word carried divine weight. When you recorded that kingship descended from heaven, you weren't stating poetry. You were reaffirming the cosmic order. The sky, the flood, the temple, the king, all threads of one design. The ruler wasn't a politician. He was the axis of the world, the chosen vessel that balanced heaven and earth. Without him, chaos reigned. And so the king list wasn't just a document, it was a spell against disorder. Look at how it's structured, city by city. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. Each one holds a king, and each king a reign stretching across impossible time. The earliest rulers, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, are not depicted as mortals. They are almost conceptual beings, bridging creation itself and governance. The scribes who wrote their names weren't chronicling men. They were describing divine stations. When you read Alulim reigned for 2800 years, the number isn't random. It's the cycle of divine completion repeated 12 times, a code only the initiated could interpret fully. And then, the flood, that single line. So quiet, yet so devastating. Then the flood swept over. No flourish, no detail, no tragedy, just inevitability. In that pause between one world and another lies the core of the Sumerian imagination. Every civilization since has retold that story. Water erasing arrogance, gods resetting creation. After the flood, the rains shrink, but the sacred pattern doesn't vanish. Kings still rule, but now their blood is thinner, their connection to the divine weaker. Humanity has inherited the throne, but the memory of godlike predecessors lingers like smoke. When archaeologists first uncovered the king list in the early 20th century, they didn't know what to do with it. Some thought it was myth, others political propaganda. A few, like Thorkild Jacobsen, realized something deeper. It was both, a blend of history and theology, of record and ritual. The Sumerians used it to unify their fractured city-states. By writing a single continuous list of kings, they imposed order on a chaotic past. It didn't matter that some reigns were absurd. What mattered was the story. Kingship had always existed, handed down from the gods. That belief made the world coherent. But there's another layer. If you map the cities of the early list, they form a deliberate pattern along the rivers, the lifelines of ancient Mesopotamia. It's almost as if the flow of kingship mirrors the flow of water, divine authority cascading downstream from Eridu, the first city, toward the later centers of Uruk and Ur. Each time kingship descends anew after the flood, it moves northward, like civilization itself spreading from its mythic source. What the Sumerians may have encoded here is the memory of migration, of one culture seeding another under the guise of divine succession. Let's pause and think about what that means. This list could be our oldest surviving roadmap of civilization's birth. Not a list of fantasies, but a poetic reconstruction of real transitions, from tribal elders to city-states, from nomads to builders, from gods to men. Each 1,000-year reign might compress generations of rulers remembered as one continuous figure. In that case, Alulim isn't a man at all. He's the memory of an era, the first time humans built walls, named a king, and began to record time. Myth as history, history as myth. Now, when we read that kingship descended from heaven, the modern mind pictures a metaphor. But what if, to the Sumerians, it was literal? Heaven in their language, Anne, wasn't just the sky. It was the realm of order, light, and the gods. When they said kingship came from heaven, they were saying that rule came from a higher plane, from beings who possessed knowledge humans couldn't grasp. To them, wisdom itself was a celestial substance. Every law, every measure, every craft was a divine gift. The king was the conduit, not the creator. This idea didn't stay confined to Sumer. It spread like a seed through the Fertile Crescent. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians all adopted the same principle, that power must have divine sanction. Even in Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a man. He was the Ka of the gods, the living Horus. You can trace this inheritance straight back to the Sumerian king list, the world's first attempt to make kingship eternal, to fuse human ambition with cosmic inevitability. But there's still something haunting in those impossible numbers. What if they preserve a truth we can't yet measure? Some ancient texts describe a time before written language, when beings of great stature ruled over men. We can dismiss that as mythology, or we can acknowledge it as memory refracted through millennia. Maybe those vast reigns mark not years, but cycles, astronomical, seasonal, or even cataclysmic. If we decode them correctly, they might reveal how the ancients tracked the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Every civilization since Sumer has tried to rewrite what they began. Egypt with its divine pharaohs, Israel with its anointed kings, Rome with its god emperors, medieval Europe with its divine right of kings. But the blueprint was already set in clay. The Sumerians taught the world how to bind heaven to politics, how to sanctify power by embedding it in myth. The king list is the original contract between gods and rulers, a contract humanity has been renegotiating ever since. And yet, there's a fragile humility hidden between those lines. When the Sumerians wrote that kingship descended, they were admitting that it could also be withdrawn. The gods give, the gods take away. Every empire that followed inherited that fear. Perhaps that's why they all left behind monuments, inscriptions, and lists to make the divine memory permanent, to remind the heavens that they once held the crown. Think about it. Every time we inscribe names on stone, every time we record who ruled and for how long, we're continuing their ritual. We're writing our own king lists, politicians, presidents, dynasties, trying to impose meaning on the chaos of time. The Sumerians began that instinct, and maybe that's why their tablets still speak. They remind us that civilization itself was built on the need to believe that someone, somewhere, was chosen to lead. So when we look at the Sumerian king list, we're not just reading about kings, we're reading about ourselves, our need for order, our fear of oblivion, our hunger for the divine. Whether these were the first kings on earth or not, their story is the first reflection humanity ever carved of its own authority. The question that lingers is simple. If the first kings ruled with divine sanction, what happened when that connection faded? What replaced it, and what did humanity lose in the process? Because somewhere between Eridu's sacred temples and the cities that came after, something shifted. Kings became men, men became rulers, and the gods went silent. When you stand in the ruins of Eridu, the place where it all supposedly began, the silence carries a strange weight. The air hums faintly with the sound of nothingness, of wind moving through broken walls, of sand grinding against ancient stone. To the untrained eye, it's just a collection of mounds, fragments of pottery, and a few cracked bricks that once formed a ziggurat. But to those who know what they're looking at, this is where the story of kingship began. Eridu wasn't just a city, it was a statement that humanity could build permanence in a world of shifting sand and floods. Archaeologists describe Eridu as the earliest city in southern Mesopotamia, founded sometime around 5400 BCE. But the Sumerians themselves believed something far greater. According to their own tradition, this was the city the gods themselves built, the cradle of civilization, the meeting point between heaven and earth. When the first king, Alulim, ruled here, he wasn't merely a man sitting on a throne. He was the living embodiment of divine will. His reign, recorded at 28,800 years, wasn't a number meant to impress. It was a symbol of eternity, a reminder that Eridu existed before history, in the dawn light of creation. Every generation that came after Alulim looked back toward that mythical golden age, trying to recapture what was lost. The kings of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash all invoked Eridu's name to legitimize their own thrones. They were echoing a formula that still persists today. When power fades, invoke the past. Claim to restore what was once pure. Even our modern leaders do this. The faces change, but the ritual remains the same. Now imagine being a citizen in one of those early cities. The world around you is small. Mud brick houses, reed boats, the endless hum of cicadas along the canals. You wake to the sound of the temple drums, signaling the day's beginning. The temple isn't just a place of worship. It's the center of everything. Politics, trade, justice, all flow through it. When the priest-king speaks, you listen, because he isn't speaking as himself. He's speaking as the voice of Enki, the god of wisdom and water, the same god who, according to legend, once ruled from Eridu before handing kingship to men. That's the unbroken chain, the idea that what happens in the temple is mirrored in heaven. The deeper we look, the more this pattern repeats. Every time a dynasty collapses, the next one claims to restore the old divine order. When Sumer fractured into warring city-states, each one said their god had been the original source of kingship. Nippur said it was Enlil. Ur said it was Nana. Lagash claimed Ningirsu. Each version rewrote the past to justify the present. That's what makes the king list so extraordinary. It attempted to bring all those competing narratives together into one unshakable structure. It was political theology carved in clay. But that unity came at a cost. By smoothing over contradictions, the scribes flattened centuries of complexity into a single lineage. The divine became bureaucratic. The gods, once wild and unpredictable, were now portrayed as administrators of destiny, distributing kingship like a cosmic office assignment. Kingship descended from heaven, yes, but always to the city that held the favor of the gods at that time. When Eridu's power faded, kingship was carried to Bad Tibira. When Bad Tibira fell, it was carried to Larak. It moved like a crown of fire, passing from one center to the next, legitimizing each new ruler and erasing the chaos in between. There's something haunting in that rhythm. It's the same rhythm empires have followed ever since. Power collapses, a new city rises, the story restarts, the names change, but the pattern endures. Rome, Constantinople, Baghdad, London, Washington, each one convinced that the torch of divine authority has passed to them. The Sumerians invented that illusion, and maybe they believed it too. One of the most fascinating details about the king list is how it treats the flood. It doesn't describe it. It doesn't linger. It just happens. A line break in the clay. Before, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After, everything changes. That silence says more than any elaborate myth could. It's the moment when divine perfection ends and history begins. The Sumerians knew that the flood wasn't just a story of destruction. It was a story of separation. After the flood, gods stop walking among men. Mortality becomes permanent. The gods retreat to the heavens, and humanity inherits the ruins. But maybe deep down, the Sumerians believed the gods hadn't fully left. Maybe they still listened through the temples, still chose kings through dreams and omens. That's why every Sumerian ruler built massive temples, ziggurats that pierced the clouds. Those weren't monuments of ego. They were stairways, literal bridges meant to reconnect heaven and earth, to rebuild the link that had been lost after the flood. Every brick was a prayer. Now think about this. The earliest cities were arranged according to celestial patterns. The main temples aligned with specific stars and solstices. The city was a mirror of the sky. When the king stood on the ziggurat, he wasn't just addressing his people. He was standing at the center of the cosmos, Every ritual, every harvest, every law was synchronized with the rhythm of the heavens. That's what made him divine. He wasn't powerful because he commanded armies. He was powerful because he represented balance. He was the living calendar that kept the world in harmony. The tragedy of Sumer is that this harmony never lasted. The same divine authority that unified the people also sowed division. Each city claimed its god was supreme, and therefore its king was the true heir of heaven. War became inevitable. The very system designed to preserve order turned into a machine of chaos. Yet through it all, the scribes kept copying the king list, updating it, extending it, believing that no matter how many cities burned, kingship itself would endure. They could lose everything, but not the idea. When the first archaeologists translated those tablets, they didn't realize that the Sumerians had given the world more than a record of rulers. They'd given us a pattern for civilization itself. Even today we still follow it. We crown leaders, build monuments, claim moral superiority, and write lists to make sense of the chaos we create. The Sumerians simply did it first, and they did it in a language shaped like stars and wedges. But here's what keeps me awake at night. If the king list truly preserves memory older than Sumer, if those first divine kings represent something real, then the flood wasn't just a story. It was an erasure, a reset of civilization. Maybe Alulim and his kin weren't gods at all. Maybe they were survivors of an earlier world, custodians of forgotten knowledge, mistaken for gods by the generations that followed. And when the flood came, it didn't just wash away cities, it washed away context. Only fragments remained. Names, reigns, numbers, echoes carved in clay. Every empire since has been chasing that echo, building towers to the sky, searching for the lost connection between the human and the divine. But maybe that connection never truly vanished. Maybe it hides in the stories we tell, the rituals we repeat, the names we whisper when we talk about the first kings. The Sumerians believed kingship descended from heaven. What if they were right, and it's still descending in ways we no longer recognize? As the last light fades from the ruins of Eridu, you can almost imagine the shadow of Alulim standing among the reeds, looking over a world that has forgotten him. His city is gone, his temple collapsed, but his name endures. And maybe that was the point all along, to ensure that no matter how many floods came, no matter how many ages passed, the memory of the first kings on earth would never die. Picture the aftermath of that flood the Sumerians spoke of, a landscape wiped clean, the horizon littered with fragments of what used to be cities. The survivors stand in silence, the world around them nothing but mud, shattered bricks, and the bones of what was once divine order. In that silence they start again. They build fires, shape new clay, and retell the story of how everything was washed away, not as tragedy, but as renewal. Kingship, they say, has descended again. Humanity has been given a second chance, and this time the rulers are mortal, but their blood still remembers the gods. The king list marks this moment with a single transition. After the flood, kingship descended once more from heaven, landing in the city of Kish. Kish becomes the birthplace of the new world order, the first city of men, not gods. The first line of kings after the flood is led by Jusha, a ruler whose name means foundation. Even the language betrays the intention. This isn't just a political restart, it's a cosmic reboot. The first divine age is over. History begins now. The gods have stepped back, but they haven't disappeared. They still whisper in the background, guiding the hands of those who build, rule, and remember. In this new era, kings are no longer immortal, but they're still sacred. Their reigns shrink to decades instead of millennia. Yet the aura of the divine lingers around their crowns. The people of Kish, and later Uruk, see their rulers as bridges between heaven and earth, living proof that the gods still care enough to choose leaders. The rituals continue, the offerings, the sacrifices, the chants. They're not just acts of devotion, but of reassurance. Each ritual says, "We are still seen, we have not been abandoned." It's in this period that we meet one of the most fascinating transitions in the king list, from nameless, semi-divine figures to kings who start to resemble real people. Etana, for example, the shepherd who ascended to heaven, blurs that line beautifully. His legend tells of a man who rode an eagle to the heavens in search of the plant of birth so that he might have a son. Scholars see it as myth, but the king list treats him as history. He's not a story, he's a reign. That's the genius of the Sumerians. They didn't separate myth from record. To them, truth wasn't about evidence, it was about meaning. Etana's ascent speaks to something deeply human. He's the first mortal king trying to regain the connection the flood severed. When he flies toward the heavens, he's not just looking for an heir. He's trying to restore what Alulim and the god-kings once had, a direct line to the divine. The myth makes him the prototype of every leader who ever looked upward and thought, "What if I could speak to them again?" You can see echoes of him in every culture that followed, the pharaohs building pyramids as stairways, the emperors of China claiming descent from the sky, the Roman Caesars calling themselves sons of gods. Etana was their spiritual ancestor. By the time we reach Uruk in the king list, history has finally begun to leave footprints we can still find. Clay tablets, cylinder seals, ruins of ziggurats, all evidence of the world the Sumerians described. Here, the legendary meets the historical in the figure of Gilgamesh. His reign, listed at 126 years, marks the tipping point between the mythic and the human. Gilgamesh is the first king we can almost touch. His name appears not just in the king list, but in epic poetry, inscriptions, and temple dedications. For the first time, the divine bloodline is tethered to a person whose ambitions, fears, and failures feel like our own. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's impossible not to see the shadow of the king list behind it. The epic is a man's desperate attempt to reclaim what the flood took away: immortality, divine favor, permanence. Gilgamesh's quest to find eternal life is the human echo of the Sumerian gods withdrawing from the world. The king list shows us the political face of that loss. The epic shows us the emotional one. Together, they form the complete picture, a civilization mourning the silence of the heavens, trying to rebuild meaning through kingship and story. And yet, Gilgamesh's journey ends where all mortal journeys do. He fails. He returns to Uruk and looks upon the great walls he built, the walls that will outlast him. In that moment, he realizes the only immortality left to men is legacy. The same logic applies to the king list itself. Every name carved into clay is a defiance of death. Every reign recorded is a victory over forgetting. That's why the Sumerians kept adding to the list long after the divine kings were gone. It wasn't just record-keeping, it was resurrection. The flood, in that sense, didn't just end an era, it created the idea of history. Before the flood, time was cyclical, divine, infinite. After the flood, it became linear, mortal, measurable. The Sumerians were the first people to see themselves as existing in a timeline, not an endless loop. The king list was their way of stitching continuity across that rupture, of saying, "We are still part of the divine story, even if the gods no longer walk among us. But look closer and you'll see something subtler." The king list doesn't treat the flood as punishment, the way later religions do. It treats it as transition. It's not wrath, it's renewal. The gods cleanse the world not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, to reset the balance between heaven and earth. Afterward, kingship is given back to humanity as a trust. It's almost compassionate, a second chance to rule wisely. And that raises a question that echoes down the ages. Did humanity live up to that trust? What's fascinating is how the Sumerians seemed to sense their own impermanence. They built with mud brick, knowing it wouldn't last, but they carved their truths into clay tablets that could. They lived in cities doomed to decay, yet they recorded names meant to outlive mountains. That paradox is the core of Sumerian genius, an unshakable belief that memory is stronger than stone. Maybe that's why their voices still reach us after 5,000 years. We can also see, through the king list, the psychological evolution of humanity itself. In the divine age, we were children of the gods, dependent, passive, protected. After the flood, we became adolescents, curious, ambitious, rebellious. The kings who followed weren't content to serve the gods. They wanted to emulate them, Etana flying to heaven, Gilgamesh seeking immortality. They are the first humans daring to cross the boundaries set by their creators. It's no coincidence that civilization began here. When humanity stopped waiting for the gods and started acting like them, history was born. And yet, the king list preserves a warning beneath its chronology. Every time kingship descends again, it's because the previous line fell to corruption or hubris. Divine authority, the text implies, can never be owned, only borrowed. The moment a ruler forgets that, disaster follows. You can trace that same rhythm in every empire that came after: rise, arrogance, collapse, renewal. The Sumerians didn't just invent kingship. They invented the cycle of power. If you were to stand inside one of those Sumerian temples today, you'd see walls once covered in color: lapis lazuli blues, golden murals of winged gods, carvings of eagles and lions watching over the throne. Every surface whispered the same message: remember who gave you power, remember where it came from. The kings obeyed until they didn't. And when they forgot, the gods went silent again. The flood never truly ended. It just changed form. It became drought, invasion, plague, decline, waves of destruction washing over every civilization that followed. Each time, a new people rose and claimed that kingship had descended once more. The story repeated itself from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to Persia, from Greece to Rome. Every empire carried the same seed planted in the mud of Eridu, the belief that their rule was sanctioned by heaven. What the king list doesn't tell us directly, but what it implies through its silence, is that the line never really broke. The divine kings may have vanished, but their shadow stretches through history. Every crown, every coronation, every oath sworn by divine right is an echo of those first names on clay. Even now, when we elect leaders and call them chosen, when we place faith in the idea of destiny, we're repeating an ancient ritual written before time began. Maybe that's the true power of the Sumerian king list. Not that it recorded who ruled, but that it taught humanity how to believe in rulership. It created the architecture of faith that still supports our societies today. It turned authority into story, and story into eternity. As we move deeper into this ancient record, a question begins to form in the dust. What if the king list isn't just a memory of the past, but a mirror for the present? What if every age, ours included, is still living within its cycle of rise, flood, and renewal? That's where we're headed next, into the heart of the flood itself, into the moment when the gods withdrew and humanity was forced to carry on alone. Because understanding that moment means understanding the very beginning of what it means to be human. In the oldest layers of Sumerian myth, the flood isn't an end. It's a silence before rebirth. When the waters recede, the world is soft and unformed again, the horizon stretching into emptiness. The first survivors emerge not as conquerors, but as caretakers, trying to remember how to speak to the gods who once walked among them. The soil still smells of salt and ash, and the rivers run thick with silt. It's in this new, quiet world that the foundations of civilization are rebuilt, brick by brick, law by law, king by king. The flood line in the king list marks the exact fracture where divine eternity breaks into mortal time. Before the flood, time is vertical, descending from heaven. After the flood, it becomes horizontal, unfolding through generations. That's why every reign after the flood feels shorter, more human and more fragile. The divine light is dimmer now, but it's still there, flickering through the hands of the kings who rule. They no longer command creation, but they organize it. They irrigate, they measure, they write. In a strange way, humanity has inherited the gods' unfinished work. The first city to rise from the mud is Kish. Archaeologists have found its ruins near the modern town of Tel al-Uhaymir in Iraq. Beneath layers of silt lie traces of rebuilding, a pattern of foundations suggesting deliberate reconstruction after a catastrophic flood. And above those layers, the first monumental architecture built entirely by human hands. No divine intervention this time, just human ingenuity and fear. Because fear, more than faith, drives the birth of civilization. Fear of the next flood, fear of the gods' silence, fear of forgetting what came before. Gushur, the first post-flood king of Kish, rules for 200 years according to the tablets, still impossibly long, but infinitely shorter than Alulim's cosmic reign. The scribes knew what they were doing. The numbers are shrinking on purpose, signaling the slow withdrawal of divine power. Every new reign is a step further from heaven. Humanity is learning to stand on its own. Under Jushur and his successors, kingship takes on a new role. It becomes service. The king is no longer a god, but the chosen instrument of the gods. He must ensure the canals flow, the temples stand, the rituals continue. His power is conditional. If he fails, the flood will return. Every Sumerian king lives with that looming threat, a constant reminder that order must be renewed daily through devotion and justice. This is the first bureaucracy of the human soul, a kingdom of fear disguised as faith. And yet out of that fear comes brilliance, writing, mathematics, the wheel, all born from the need to prevent chaos. The Sumerians don't just worship their gods, they try to imitate them. Every irrigation channel, every boundary stone, every law inscribed in clay is an act of divine imitation. The gods shaped the world, humans now shape cities. The line between creation and administration blurs, and in that blur, the first governments arise. The king list reflects this transition perfectly. Its rhythm changes. Gone are the vast, timeless reigns. Now we see succession, dynasties, conflict, restoration. The flood has given the world mortality, but also continuity. It's the first glimpse of history as we understand it. Messy, political, fragile, but alive. The names after the flood begin to sound more human. Etana, Enmenuna, Barsalnuna. No longer celestial beings, but rulers with stories, ambitions, failures. Etana, the shepherd king, embodies this new human struggle. His story, preserved alongside his name in the king list, tells of longing for an heir, for meaning, for a link to heaven. When he rides the eagle upward, it's not triumph, it's yearning. The further he ascends, the more fragile the connection becomes. In one version, he reaches the sky. In another, the eagle's wings burn and he falls. Either way, his story ends the same way all human stories do, with descent. The heavens remain out of reach, but the message is clear. Humanity's role has changed. We no longer live among gods. We remember them. And through remembrance, we rebuild the world. That's why the king list is not just a chronicle, it's a ritual of remembrance disguised as history. Each king is a verse in a long hymn to continuity, a promise that as long as humans record, they will never fully lose what the gods once gave. As we move from Kish to Uruk, the pace of the list accelerates. Civilization is spreading, writing is flourishing, temples multiply. The gods are quieter, but humans are louder than ever. The sound of hammers, the scratch of reeds on clay, the chants of priests, all blend into a new kind of music, the rhythm of civilization itself. This is the age of invention, of trade, of language blooming like a new Eden. Yet with progress comes pride. The same kings who once knelt before their gods begin to imagine themselves as equals. Their temples rise higher, their armies grow larger, their inscriptions bolder. Each ruler wants his name to outlast the flood, to defy time itself. They don't realize that by doing so, they are repeating the same hubris that ended the divine age. The gods no longer need to send another flood. Humanity is perfectly capable of drowning itself in ambition. By the time Gilgamesh ascends the throne of Uruk, the divine silence is complete. The gods still exist, but they no longer speak directly. Dreams, omens, storms, these are their whispers. Gilgamesh listens, but he also argues, defies, questions. He is half divine, half human, the embodiment of a civilization that remembers the gods but refuses to submit to them. His story is the bridge between the king list and philosophy, between myth and introspection. When Gilgamesh sets out to find Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the flood, he isn't just seeking eternal life. He's seeking the lost age of Alulim and Al-Algar, the time when kings ruled forever. But Utnapishtim tells him what the king list already implies. Immortality belongs to the gods. Humanity's gift is memory, not eternity. The flood didn't erase history. It created it. And that's the paradox at the heart of this story. The flood destroyed the divine kings, yet their memory became immortal. The mortal kings who followed sought eternal fame, and in chasing it, they preserved the divine lineage through words, not blood. Clay replaced divinity. The stylus replaced the scepter. In the end, the scribes became the true kings of Sumer, the keepers of what even the gods had abandoned. As the centuries passed, the king list grew longer. More cities claimed their place in the lineage. Kish gave way to Uruk, Uruk to Ur, Ur to Akkad. Each one declared itself the rightful heir to heaven's authority, and each, in turn, fell. But the list never stopped. It was rewritten, reinterpreted, reinscribed, always beginning with the same phrase, "Kingship descended from heaven." It's both a declaration and a warning. Because if kingship can descend, it can also ascend. It can vanish like the gods themselves, leaving humanity to face the flood once more, whatever form that flood may take. The Sumerians understood that the flood wasn't just water. It was chaos, ignorance, forgetting. The real flood is amnesia, the moment when civilizations stop remembering where their order came from. The king list is humanity's first dam against that tide. It's a plea written in clay. Remember who we were, or the waters will rise again. And maybe they were right. Because even now, thousands of years later, we're still building our walls, still making our lists, still praying that memory will hold. The names change. Alulim becomes Alexander, Gilgamesh becomes Caesar, Kish becomes Babylon, Uruk becomes New York. But the story remains. Kings rise, floods come, the clay endures. So as we move deeper into this mystery, keep that image in mind. The survivors of the flood kneeling in the mud, carving the first words of history into wet clay. They didn't know we'd still be reading them 5,000 years later. But maybe that's exactly why they wrote them. The air over ancient Kish must have shimmered with heat, the kind that bends light, makes cities look like mirages. Imagine walking through those early streets, the smell of baked clay and river mud, the echo of chants drifting from a temple whose walls are painted with stories of gods who once ruled the world. In the marketplace, traders argue over barley and copper, while scribes kneel in the shade, pressing reeds into clay. To them, every word is sacred. They're not just recording trade or taxes, they're maintaining the cosmic order. Because if names fade, if records vanish, the link to the divine vanishes too. That's the truth the Sumerians knew better than anyone. Memory is survival. The gods might have retreated, but as long as humans remembered their names, the connection held. Every king after the flood became part historian, part priest, part engineer. They didn't just rule, they maintained balance. To rule in Sumer wasn't to command armies. It was to align heaven and earth, to make sure the rivers flooded just enough, the stars rose on time, the temples resonated with the voices of the gods. That was kingship, not power, but equilibrium. When you look at the ruins of Kish today, you see little more than dunes and broken bricks, but buried beneath are traces of the first administrative system in history. Bureaucracy might sound lifeless, but here it was divine. Tablets record temple rations, harvest tallies, labor divisions, all written under the gaze of gods carved into the walls. Order itself was worship. Chaos was sin. The flood had proven that disobedience meant annihilation, so humanity responded by systematizing faith. The king list was the cornerstone of that system, a cosmic filing cabinet proving that every ruler, every city was part of an unbroken heavenly plan. But history never sits still. Power moved. After Kish came Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, the city of walls and ambition. Here the flood had become memory, not fear. The rivers were controlled, the canals tamed, and the gods' temples towered above the plains. Humanity had mastered survival, but mastery brings pride, and pride brings restlessness. In Gilgamesh, the half-divine king, that restlessness becomes a story. He's not content to rule. He wants to transcend. The flood may have ended, but its lesson, to know your place, was already fading. You can almost picture him at the top of Uruk's walls, staring at the horizon, knowing that every brick below him bears his name. The king list says he reigned for 126 years. The epic says he conquered monsters and sought immortality. Both versions tell the same truth. The age of gods was over, but the hunger for eternity remained. Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim, the immortal man, isn't just one king's adventure, it's humanity's second flood. A flood of questions, a flood of doubt. If the gods no longer walk among us, how do we live without them? That's what makes the king list so haunting. It doesn't try to answer that question, it just keeps listing names. Gilgamesh dies, Uruk falls, Ur rises, then falls again. The gods don't intervene, they simply watch. The list becomes a mirror of mortality, one name fading into the next, each claiming divine favor, each eventually forgotten. The Sumerians may have believed kingship descended from heaven, but by the time the last tablet was written, kingship had become unmistakably human, fragile, temporary, dependent on memory alone. But here's the paradox. In trying to immortalize their rulers, the Sumerians accidentally immortalized themselves. Their kings are dust, their cities gone, but their words survive. The act of writing, the divine spark they claimed came from the gods, outlasted every dynasty. Maybe that's the real descent of kingship, not from heaven to earth, but from the voice to the word, from flesh to clay. The gods gave humanity language, and language became power. Archaeologists have found over 15 versions of the king list across Mesopotamia, each slightly different. Some emphasize different cities, others rearrange the order of kings. That means it wasn't just a static record, it was alive. Each generation rewrote it to reflect its own truth, its own claim to legitimacy. That flexibility is what kept the myth breathing. If kingship really did descend from heaven, then it also adapted, evolving as humans did. The divine wasn't lost, it was reinterpreted, and yet every revision carries an undertone of anxiety. You can feel it in the tablets, the fear of being forgotten, the desperate insistence that kingship never truly dies. The Sumerians knew what every empire learns too late. Power isn't eternal, But story is. The king list didn't preserve kingdoms, it preserved their meaning. That's why even today, we remember Gilgamesh, Alulim, and Etana, but not the bureaucrats or generals who actually kept the cities running. The storytellers became the true keepers of power. The deeper you go into the king list, the more it feels less like a history and more like a heartbeat. Steady, rhythmic, eternal. Each name pulses once, then disappears. It's hypnotic. The repetition becomes a mantra. Life, rule, death, renewal. Kingship descended from heaven. Kingship descended again. Over and over. It's almost as if the scribes were whispering to themselves, "Don't let the silence return." The silence, that's what terrified them most. Not chaos, not war, but silence. The gods had once spoken through floods and lightning. Now they spoke through symbols on clay. Every wedge pressed into the tablet was an attempt to keep the voice alive. In that sense, the king list isn't about kings at all. It's about communication, the human refusal to stop talking to the divine, even when the divine stops answering. And maybe that's why the list continues beyond the borders of Sumer. When the Akkadians conquer, they inherit it. When Babylon rises, it extends it. When Assyria falls, someone still copies it. The names change languages, but the structure remains. Kingship always descends, never dies. Even in exile, the pattern endures. It becomes scripture, law, lineage. It becomes us. Because in truth, every civilization writes its own king list. The medium changes from clay to parchment to screens, but the impulse is the same, to prove we belong in a story that began before us, that we are part of something bigger, something that once touched the heavens. And if we listen closely, that whisper still lingers beneath the noise of our modern empires. The flood isn't water anymore, it's time. And like the Sumerians, we're still trying to build walls high enough to hold it back. When you stand on the windswept plain where Uruk once rose, the earth itself seems to breathe. Beneath your feet are the bones of the world's first metropolis, streets that once echoed with the sound of carts, hymns, and human ambition. The people of Uruk lived in a place that had become myth even to themselves. Its walls were said to stretch 6 miles around, built by a king who wanted eternity, not protection. Every brick was stamped with his name. Every tower pointed upward, as if the city itself was trying to climb back to heaven. By the time Uruk flourished, the idea of kingship had evolved into something almost philosophical. No longer just divine mandate, it was purpose. A Sumerian king wasn't simply chosen by the gods. He was expected to act like one. Justice, order, fertility, the balance of the seasons, all of it hung on his shoulders. If the canals overflowed or the crops failed, it wasn't the weather's fault, it was his. In a sense, every Sumerian king lived in the shadow of Alulim, the first ruler of the divine age, forever trying to match a perfection that no mortal could reach. It's here that we begin to see the tragedy of the king list, the tension between godlike expectation and human limitation. Each king inherits the burden of cosmic order, but lacks the immortality to sustain it. The result is inevitable collapse, and yet after every fall another name appears. The rhythm continues. The divine pattern reasserts itself. You can almost feel the desperation behind it, as if the scribes were trying to convince themselves that humanity could fill the silence the gods left behind. The flood may have ended the divine age, but it also sparked something entirely new, self-awareness. The Sumerians were the first people to write their own mortality into clay, and Uruk was the first city to confront it. Its epics, laws, and laments are filled with the same question that haunted Gilgamesh. How do we live knowing that everything ends? The king list answers with continuity. The Epic of Gilgamesh answers with acceptance. Together they form the foundation of civilization's consciousness. Duty on one side, meaning on the other. And still, something in the king list resists closure. Even as it moves through generations, the idea that kingship descends never fades. It's not born of the people, it's granted. That belief is more than religious poetry, it's political technology. The Sumerians understood what modern rulers still know. If your power seems divine, it becomes unquestionable. A king who claims descent from heaven doesn't need an army to rule hearts. He rules through myth, and myth doesn't die when cities fall. But there's an undertone of rebellion buried deep in the text. The farther we move from Eridu, the more the kings act like men. They wage wars, broker alliances, make mistakes. Some are praised, others condemned. The scribes start writing not just who ruled, but how they ruled. History in the modern sense is being born, messy, flawed, human. The king list, which began as theology, is slowly turning into journalism. The gods are fading, and the writers are taking their place. The shift is so gradual, you almost miss it. In the earlier lines, the verbs are passive. Kingship descended. The flood came. It was carried to Uruk. But later the language changes. Gilgamesh built. Aga of Kish fought. Ur conquered Lagash. Action returns to human hands. The divine voice gives way to human agency. It's the linguistic moment when mythology transforms into history, when humanity stops being written about and starts writing itself. And yet, the list never abandons the divine completely. Even in its most human moments, it begins every dynasty with the same refrain. Then kingship descended again. It's as if the scribes couldn't bear to imagine a world where heaven had truly gone silent. The repetition is a ritual, a mantra against chaos. Maybe they knew that without belief, civilization would unravel. Faith wasn't decoration, it was infrastructure. Every new king inherits not only the throne, but the burden of continuity. He must perform the same ceremonies, utter the same invocations, rebuild the same temples. The king list isn't just history, it's a manual. It teaches rulers how to behave, how to justify their reigns, how to mirror the first kings. You can almost hear the whisper behind the words, "Act divine, or the flood will return." But even in the midst of divine imitation, you sense a quiet skepticism growing. The Sumerians were realists. They built their theology out of observation as much as faith. When the rains came late, they blamed the gods. But they also improved their irrigation systems. When cities fell, they prayed, but they also studied the mistakes that caused it. Over time, the balance shifted. Divine intervention became metaphor, and human responsibility became doctrine. The king list, which once looked upward for meaning, now looks inward. That's what makes it timeless. Beneath the numbers and names, you can feel the emergence of something universal. The awareness that humanity is alone, but not powerless. The divine may have left the earth, but its reflection remains in our hands, our art, our laws. Every ruler since has tried to fill that void, to wear the crown of heaven while standing firmly on the ground. And every empire since has paid the price for forgetting the lesson the king list tries to teach. Kingship descends, but it can also be withdrawn. The end of the Sumerian king list, as we have it, fades into fragments. Later rulers added their names, their victories, their myths, until the clay could hold no more. The divine lineage became bureaucratic record, and eventually, silence. The tablets break off. The story ends mid-sentence, as if the scribes themselves finally understood that no list, no matter how sacred, can capture eternity. And maybe that's the most human ending of all. Not a flood, not divine wrath, just a pause, a recognition that the story goes on elsewhere, in other languages, other empires, other dreams of heaven, because in a way the king list never ended. We're still writing it. Every leader we elect, every nation we build, every record we keep, it's another line in the same endless sequence. The gods may have vanished, but kingship, in one form or another, still descends. In the centuries after Uruk's rise, something remarkable happened. The story of kingship spread, carried on trade routes, carved into tablets, retold in the tongues of empires yet unborn. What began as a Sumerian idea became the foundation of the entire Near Eastern world. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all inherited the same dream, that power is not invented but inherited from the heavens. The king list was no longer just a record, it had become a philosophy, a code embedded into the DNA of civilization. When Sargon of Akkad rose to power around 2300 BCE, he understood this perfectly. He wasn't Sumerian by birth, yet he claimed to be chosen by the goddess Ishtar herself. His scribes took the old Sumerian king list and rewrote it, placing Akkad, the new empire, at the center of the lineage. The divine chain of rulers had to continue, even if it meant rearranging the past. That's how powerful the idea was. No conqueror could afford to reject it. Instead, they absorbed it, reshaping it to legitimize themselves. Sargon's empire was the first to stretch beyond Sumer, binding dozens of cities under one banner. In doing so, he transformed the idea of kingship from something local and sacred to something imperial and strategic. Where once kings ruled to maintain cosmic balance, now they ruled to expand it. The heavens had become an empire of their own, one that required conquest to stay divine. This was the next stage in the evolution of the king list, from memory to propaganda. But even as Sargon's armies marched across the Mesopotamian plain, his scribes kept writing. They copied the names of kings who came before him, not to honor them, but to absorb their legitimacy. Every victory tablet began the same way. Kingship descended from heaven. It's as if the phrase itself had become a weapon, a seal of cosmic approval. The Sumerians had invented the narrative, the Akkadians industrialized it. Yet the deeper you look, the clearer a pattern emerges. Every empire that inherits the king list also inherits its curse. After Sargon's death, his sons ruled briefly before the empire fell into chaos. The gods had descended, but then withdrew again. Akkad was struck by drought, rebellion, invasion. The divine mandate had shifted once more, this time to Ur. The same cycle repeated: rise, expansion, decay, silence. The king list had warned of this rhythm, but no ruler could resist believing that his reign would be the one to break it. In the city of Ur, kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi revived the Sumerian dream. They rebuilt temples, standardized weights and measures, wrote hymns in their own honor. Ur-Nammu even issued the world's first known law code, claiming that the moon god Nana had chosen him to establish equity in the land. Every decree, every line of law was framed as divine instruction, not human reason. The divine age had been reimagined, not as literal god-kings, but as rulers guided by divine justice. If you stood in Ur during Shulgi's reign, you'd see a city reborn. Its ziggurat gleamed in the sun, the canals flowed like veins through the desert, and at night the priests read the stars for omens. The gods had not returned, but humanity had learned to simulate their presence. Ritual replaced revelation, ceremony replaced miracles. The Sumerians had discovered a new kind of divinity, one made of architecture, mathematics, and bureaucracy. The gods were no longer in the sky. They were in the system, and that might be the most profound transformation of all. The king list began as myth, became history, and ended as structure. The divine descended into the fabric of human society, laws, hierarchies, traditions. Even as the last Sumerian kings vanished, the idea of heavenly authority survived, mutating with every culture that borrowed it. Egypt called it Ma'at, the balance between man and the cosmos. Israel called it divine kingship through covenant. Rome called it the mandate of empire. China called it the mandate of heaven. Different words, same origin. Each version carried the same hidden fear, that kingship could be revoked. The flood might come again, in another form, rebellion, famine, plague. And when it did, it would prove that heaven had withdrawn its favor. That's why rulers from Sargon to Caesar built monuments higher, walls thicker, temples grander. They weren't building for glory. They were building to keep the silence of the gods at bay. The king list survives today not because it was accurate, but because it was right about one thing. Power is cyclical. The same rise and fall that began in Sumer still shapes the world. The actors change, but the pattern doesn't. We still crave the same divine legitimacy, even when we call it something else. Destiny, democracy, progress. We still build towers, still write our names in stone, still pray that history will remember us. If you run your fingers over one of those ancient tablets, you can feel the pressure of the scribe's hand. Each wedge pressed with precision, each line laid down with reverence. He wasn't just writing for his time. He was writing for us, to remind us that kingship, in whatever form it takes, is both a gift and a warning. It descends, it dazzles, it decays. And maybe that's the message hidden between those lines, that the flood never really ended. It just changed shape. It became time itself. The collapse of Ur's third dynasty was not the end of kingship, only the end of a chapter. When the great ziggurat of Ur fell silent, when its moon god temple lay half buried under shifting dunes, a new kind of silence descended upon the land. Not the silence of death, but of waiting. Out on the plains, where the Tigris and Euphrates still carved silver lines across the earth, the echoes of prayers lingered. The gods had retreated, yet the people still built altars. The kings had perished, yet the idea of kingship refused to die. In that silence, new voices began to rise. Amorite nomads, Akkadian scribes, and foreign princes, all seeking to inherit what the Sumerians had left behind, the right to rule with heaven's blessing. Out of that dust came Babylon, a city that began as a small trading post on the riverbank and grew into the beating heart of a new empire. Its rulers spoke a different language, worshipped under new names, but their tablets told the same story. That kingship had descended from the heavens and now flowed through them. The myth had migrated. The king list was copied, revised, and rewritten, carved anew in the language of Akkad. Babylon's kings didn't invent their authority, they inherited it through story. Each ruler presented himself not merely as a man, but as a continuation of that unbroken cosmic lineage stretching back to Eridu, to the first city, to the age when gods still walked among men. It was in this new Babylon that one of humanity's oldest ideas evolved into something larger than myth. Hammurabi, perhaps the most famous of its kings, understood that power alone was never enough. He needed justice, a divine order, to hold his empire together. When he had his laws carved into black diorite, he made sure the first image people saw was not his face, but that of the god Shamash handing him the rod and ring of kingship. The symbolism was unmistakable. Hammurabi did not create justice, he received it. He was not above his people. He was heaven's chosen interpreter of balance. Every law, every ruling, every punishment carried not just political authority, but cosmic weight. To obey the king was to obey the divine order itself. But what the Babylonians did next was even more revolutionary. They transformed divine kingship into divine accountability. The ruler was still heaven's instrument, but now he could fail heaven as well. If floods destroyed crops or enemies overran the gates, it meant the king had broken faith with the gods. Power was conditional. The same myth that elevated rulers also hung above them like a blade. It was a paradox that defined every great empire that followed. The closer one stood to heaven, the more one risked falling. When Assyria rose to power in the north, this paradox deepened. Assyrian kings called themselves kings of the universe, chosen by Ashur, their storm god, whose symbol, a winged disk, soared above their palaces. Every campaign they waged was framed as a sacred war. Every conquest was divine duty. Their walls are still etched with scenes of lions, captives, and lightning, brutal reminders that faith and empire had fused. But if you read between those lines, if you look past the boasts and bloodshed, you can sense fear. For all their might, the Assyrians knew heaven's favor was fickle. When drought came, when rebellion spread, when omens turned dark, they performed desperate rituals, sacrificing thousands to call the gods back to their side. And yet, as the king list had foretold, even the kings of the universe could not hold back the flood forever. Nineveh, once the jewel of empires, fell in fire and ash. The divine right, once so loud, faded into whispers again. Then came another inheritor, Persia. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, but rather than destroy its myths, he adopted them. He too declared that he ruled by divine command, this time from Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light. When he freed captives and restored temples, it wasn't merely strategy, it was ritual, a reaffirmation that kingship was sacred stewardship, not ownership. To the Persians, the king list's principle evolved into something moral, power as responsibility. The king was not just heaven's favorite, he was heaven's caretaker on earth. This subtle shift marked the dawn of a new concept, one that would echo all the way to modern ideas of leadership and law. But even as the empires changed, the rhythm stayed the same. Every civilization that rose on Mesopotamian soil carried the same invisible inheritance. Each claimed that kingship had descended from the heavens, and each, inevitably, faced its own flood. Sometimes the flood was literal, rivers overflowing, washing away harvests and homes. Sometimes it was metaphorical, invasion, plague, rebellion, decay. In every case, it was the same cosmic reminder that divine favor was never permanent. The gods give, the gods withdraw, and the tablets crumble. And yet, despite all the ruins, the idea never died. From the ashes of Sumer to the temples of Babylon, from Assyria's banners to Persia's palaces, the lineage endured like a heartbeat under shifting empires. The words, kingship descended from heaven, became humanity's first political equation, one we still live by, whether we realize it or not. Because even now we crave that same assurance. We might not call it divine anymore, but we still look for legitimacy that feels larger than us. We still believe in mandates, constitutions, destinies, ideas that promise order amid chaos, meaning amid uncertainty. Walk through the ruins of Ur today, and the air hums with that history. The wind sighs through broken columns. The moon still rises over the temple of Nana, just as it did 5,000 years ago. And if you stand there long enough, under the same pale light that once gleamed on Shulgi's crown, you might feel it. The pulse of continuity, the same force that drove scribes to carve names into clay, that made kings dream of heaven, that makes us still write and remember. The flood has never truly ended. It simply changed shape. It became time itself, because that's what the Sumerians understood before anyone else, that eternity isn't up there in the stars. It's here in memory, in story, in the endless rewriting of who we are. The gods may have retreated, but their greatest gift remains, the human hunger to record, to believe, and to begin again. And so the king list endures, not as a relic, but as a mirror, showing us that every empire, every leader, every age is just another name pressed into clay, waiting for the next flood to come. The museum lights hum quietly above the tablet. The clay is cracked, its edges worn smooth by the touch of centuries. Most visitors walk past it, unaware that this small, fragile artifact carries the entire story of civilization in its lines. If you lean close enough, you can still see the fingerprints pressed into the edges, the marks of a hand that lived 5,000 years ago, the hand of a scribe who believed that memory could defy death. Those impressions, are the beginning of us. The Sumerian king list isn't just a record of rulers, it's a portrait of how humanity learned to dream of eternity. In a world that had just survived its first great flood, the Sumerians did something miraculous. They refused to start over as animals. They chose memory. They looked at the ruins of their drowned cities and said, "We will remember. We will write." And from that choice came history. Imagine that first act of writing. A reed pressed into clay, sunlight glinting off wet tablets drying in the heat. The scribe sits cross-legged by a temple wall, reciting the names of kings who lived so long ago that their reigns have become myth. He knows he will die, but the names will live. Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Etana, Gilgamesh. Each word is a heartbeat. Each line is a breath against oblivion. That's what the king list truly is, not a chronicle of power, but an act of rebellion against forgetting. The flood may have wiped the earth clean, but it could not erase the idea that meaning could be preserved. The gods may have withdrawn from the world, but their echo lived on in the human need to record. Writing was the new temple, clay became the altar, and memory, sacred memory, became the new god. Through every empire that followed, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, the same pattern endured. Each civilization copied the Sumerian rhythm without even realizing it. Each built its towers, its laws, its myths around the same invisible inheritance, that kingship descends, that order is divine, that history is a cycle of fall and renewal. When Babylon rose, it rewrote the list to place itself at the center of creation. When Assyria conquered, its kings added their own names, proclaiming themselves the chosen of Asher. When Persia rose, Cyrus the Great declared that his power came from the heavens, not from conquest. Each new age carried the torch forward. Each claimed to be the continuation of that first descent from heaven. Even when the gods changed names, the story stayed the same. But the most remarkable thing isn't how long the story lasted. It's that it still hasn't ended. The same myth beats beneath the foundations of our modern world. We don't speak of gods descending anymore, but we speak of destiny, of providence, of democracy, of divine right, of history's chosen few. We've traded ziggurats for skyscrapers, clay tablets for screens, yet every one of us still believes deep down that we are part of something written long before we were born. Maybe that's why the Sumerian king list feels so strangely modern. Because it isn't about kings, it's about us. It's about our endless attempt to link ourselves to the infinite, to make sense of why power rises, why it falls, and why we keep trying again. The Sumerians saw this not as failure, but as design. Every collapse was a renewal. Every silence was a test. The gods gave us kings, took them away, and waited to see what we would build in their absence. And when we built too high, too proud, the flood returned to humble us, not out of cruelty, but to remind us that nothing human lasts forever, except story. The story is immortal. It flows beneath every empire like a river beneath sand. When cities burn, when languages die, when nations vanish, the story finds new names, new tongues, new clay. It's in the Bible's genealogies. It's in the coronations of medieval kings. It's in the charters that begin by divine will and the modern constitutions that start "We the People." It's in every oath, every anthem, every flag. A whisper of Sumer still lives in all of them. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The refrain repeats, soft but eternal. Then kingship descended from heaven. It's less a declaration than a heartbeat, slow, steady, endless. It beats through the centuries, through Uruk's dust, through Babylon's ruins, through the ruins we're still building today. Because the flood never truly ended. It just became invisible. A tide of time that erodes every monument, every empire, every illusion of permanence. It washes over marble and metal alike, and still we build, still we write, still we believe that this time will outlast it, that this wall, this city, this idea will stand against eternity. But the Sumerians understood the truth long before we did. They knew that no wall lasts, no throne stands forever. They knew that immortality doesn't belong to kings, it belongs to those who remember them. And in that way the scribes became the true heirs of heaven. They couldn't command floods or stars, but they could make a name last forever. In their quiet devotion to memory, they achieved what even the gods could not, permanence through story. So when you see that cracked tablet under glass, remember what it really represents. It's not the glory of ancient kings, it's the victory of human persistence. It's proof that even in a world ruled by gods and destroyed by floods, one fragile, finite species refused to stop recording its own existence. They didn't build their immortality from gold or stone. They built it from words. And we are the proof that they succeeded. Every time we tell their story, they live again. Every time we say Sumer, Uruk, Gilgamesh, or Alulim, the flood recedes a little further. We become the next link in their chain, the next voice in the chorus of remembering. Because kingship may have descended from heaven, but memory, the true legacy of humanity, rises from the earth. So take one last look at that tablet. It has outlasted kingdoms, wars, earthquakes, entire civilizations. It will outlast us too. And one day, someone else, thousands of years from now, may find our stories in their own ruins and wonder who we were, what we believed, and why we wrote. That's the real meaning of the King List. Not the names it contains, but the impulse that created it, the belief that meaning can survive time. It's the story of us, the first humans to remember, and the last to forget. And so, the descent continues, through clay, through words, through you. Thank you for listening to the story of the first kings on earth, and the first storytellers who made them eternal. If this journey moved you, if it made you see the ancient world not as distant but alive, then remember to leave your mark too, because somewhere in the far future, someone will look back at our world, and they'll be reading our King List, and the flood will rise again. But the story will endure.